So what does the Russian invasion of Ukraine mean for the world and indeed for India? Joining me now is one of the country's finest and most credible voices on foreign policy. Good to have former National Security Advisor, former Foreign Secretary Shivshankar Menon is joining me. Appreciate your joining us, Mr. Menon. If I may begin by asking you to give us a sense of the big picture as you see it. Do you see what's happened in Ukraine as a localized conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or do you believe this will have wider repercussions for the entire global community?
Thank you for having me, Rajdeep. Well, it seems, I can't speak for the world, but as an Indian sitting here, it seems to me that it is more than a local conflict. And it's been brewing for quite some time, and it will have much broader effects. It will affect us. It will affect certainly the situation in Europe and the relationship between the major powers, between at least some of the major powers, Russia and the West, Russia and the US certainly. But I don't think that other powers, whether it is India, whether it's China, that we can ignore the consequential changes that will happen in the world order.
Can you explain what you mean by that when you say the consequential changes in the world order? How do you see the world order changing as a result of this Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, for one thing, you're going to see much more fractious and antagonistic relations between the US and Russia. Now, for us, both are essential partners in different ways and different in terms of maritime security, defense links. We have links with both. These matter. So it's going to be more difficult. For instance, we are buying S-400 missiles from the Russians, the best in their class. And the US objects to that. Now, that's going to be much more difficult. There'll be more friction in that. But we will naturally follow our own interest in this. We will do what we have to. Secondly, when you look at the effects of this, much more Western pressure on Russia in terms of economic sanctions, this has been going on for many years, and we've already seen what it does. What it does is to consolidate and strengthen the links between Russia and China. And that changes the situation in Asia compared to what we were used to, say, 10 years ago. So we have to be prepared for that. We have to see where that goes. But for us, Russia is an essential partner. And I think what we have done so far in terms of responding to the situation, arguing for diplomacy, and arguing that basically the countries involved have interests which need to be accommodated. After all, if you think of it, the eastern borders of Ukraine are 300 kilometers from Moscow. To have NATO troops 300 kilometers from Moscow changes Russia's security calculus. Put it the other way around. Russian troops at the western borders of Ukraine are within striking distance of Berlin, Warsaw, Vienna, Prague, you name it, a whole host of European capitals. So it seems to me all sides have interests here, core interests, which they need to adjust. They need to negotiate through dialogue, find a solution. There are obvious solutions. If Ukraine were neutral, without the presence of any foreign troops. But today, in the middle of this crisis, when it's been brought to the stage where there's actual fighting going on Ukrainian soil, it's very difficult to see how we are going to get there if the powers are not talking with each other, if they're sanctioning each other, and if there is actual fighting on the ground. So sitting here in India, it is logical for us to urge dialogue and accommodation of mutual interests and a way forward which makes sense. I mean, make Ukraine non-aligned.
You say that in a way, we seem to have very limited options then, Mr. Menon, because yesterday Prime Minister Modi spoke to the Russian president, called for a cessation of hostilities, called for dialogue. Do we really have any leverage here? Is it best for us to sit out and allow the situation to develop rather than be seen to be taking sides? Is that what you're saying, that India cannot afford to take sides given our close relationship, a past relationship with Russia, and indeed the kind of relationship we share with the United States?
Well, what I'm saying is it's not for us to settle this problem. We have not created this problem. It's not for us to settle it. Today, it's very difficult to see a way forward. But we should be looking for opportunities to encourage them to find a peaceful dialogue, a peacefully negotiated settlement which accommodates their interests. And that's what we should be doing. And I think that's what the government has been doing. If you look at the public statements that we've made, what the Prime Minister said to President Putin, what we said in the Security Council, I think that's exactly the direction in which we've been pushing. And this has been steady Indian policy. 2014, when the crisis, when Russia moved into Crimea, we said exactly the same.
That's right. I could rewind the clock to early 2014 when you were actually NSA. When Russia went into Crimea, India again seemed to take the position that they didn't want to be seen to be overly critical of the Russians. There will be those, though, Mr. Menon, who will say that when Russia advocates the doctrine of limited sovereignty, whether it's for Crimea or whether it's for for eastern Ukraine, what happens today in Ukraine could well happen in other parts of the world, and including in our neighborhood. So do we need to take a stronger, more principled position on what is clearly an invasion of Ukraine, a violation of its sovereignty?
Let's be clear. We take a position based on our interests. And frankly, nobody appointed you judge, jury, and you're not here to enforce whatever you think are the right principles in the international system. Other countries act on their interests. You act on your interests as well. So our interest is in the right outcomes. If you think that picking sides or condemning somebody helps to create the right outcome, do so. But I don't see how that would work in the Ukrainian case. Ascribing blame or fault or picking sides. Frankly, I don't see how that will lead to the kind of outcome that I've been describing is in our interest, which is a peacefully negotiated accommodation of each other's interests.
But God forbid, Mr. Menon, if tomorrow, let's say China chose to, as they have done moved into Ladakh, tomorrow attempted to move into Arunachal using the limited sovereignty doctrine, where would it leave us? I mean, the point I'm making is this,
it's not
as
the
some
doctrine
people are
that's
seeing
the
it, a
problem.
fight between... Sure, no,
It's
but
not
is
the
it a fight
doctrine
between
that's the problem.
democracy? Is it a fight between
don't think
democracy
so.
and autocracy, as some are seeing it?
I don't think so. I think this is about interests and about the hard facts of power. And I think that's the way international relations work. I mean, as you said, it's countries will use whatever principles they can lay their hands on to justify their behavior and their choices. But they don't make those choices based on those principles. If China decides to move in Ladakh, as she did in 2020, she doesn't do it because of some attachment to some principle. She does it because she thinks it's in her interest and she senses an opportunity to do so. It's our job to prevent that, to deter that idea in their mind. But that we have to do. So I'm not so sure that democracy versus autocracy or any such broader principle at play here.
So are you seeing this as pure power play by Vladimir Putin, reflecting Russia's concerns, as you said, of NATO, a potential NATO ally at its doorstep? Are you seeing it as perhaps Mr. Putin wanting to, in a way, revive a sense of Russian imperialism, as some critics call it? Or is it pure and simple realpolitik, that he believes that he cannot afford to have Ukraine within the embrace of the NATO umbrella?
But this is not just Mr. Putin. Every Russian leader, ever since NATO started expanding eastwards, don't forget, there were 16 NATO members at the end of the Cold War, 1991. Today, there are 30. And NATO has been brought to Russia's borders, despite all the promises that were made to Russia. Every leader, Yeltsin to Clinton, Mr. Putin to President Bush in 2008, when they decided to admit Georgia and Ukraine as candidate members. They've always objected. This is about hard Russian security interests. But there are interests on the other side as well. As I explained, there are European capitals which are at threat, NATO members, who would be threatened by other forces in Ukraine if they were located there. So it's a question of adjusting their interests. The question is, are those involved ready to do that? Why haven't they done that? If it's so obvious, why haven't they adjusted with each other's interests? Why didn't they do what they did with Austria in 1955? Neutralize the country, say it'll be neutral, that neither side will send military forces in. Obviously, other political factors are at play. And there, I think domestic politics in the West, in Russia, probably make it more difficult. Alliance politics are at play, various factors. So there, I think, yes, and certainly there is a strong element of emotion on both sides. You can hear it in the statements, in the words that they use. And that always makes it much harder to negotiate, to find a reasonable solution.
Sure. I mean, the Russians and Ukrainians come with a lot of historical baggage. You mentioned, Mr. Menon, at the very outset, one of the consequences of antagonisms between Russia and the United States could be closer ties between Russia and China. How should India see that in terms of its interests again? We also saw Pakistan, Imran Khan, actually there in Moscow when the invasion was on. So some fears being expressed of a sort of Russia, China, Pakistan embrace. Should we be worried at all about that?
You know, I am not so worried about India-Russia ties. But Russia will seek other relationships where it's in her interest. For instance, China is an economic partner of some consequence to Russia, a major buyer of her oil and gas, for instance. And they do work together in the international order against what they see as Western hegemony in the order, in the UN, in other places. The India-Russia relationship is solid and is based on, again, mutual interest. And that's why it's been so solid for so long. So that doesn't worry me so much. But what I think we need to understand is that it changes the environment around us. And therefore, we will have to deal with the environment around us in Asia differently. Chinese behavior could change. Other states could change their behavior in response to those shifts in the environment. But this is early days yet. We have to see where this goes.
You know, that's precisely where I want to come. Where does it go? You know, there are two views. One is this is a limited war. The other is this could get prolonged. It could get messy. It could drag in others into the conflict in some form or the other. What do you think is more likely? Do you think Vladimir Putin simply wants a change of regime in Ukraine, a government there which is friendly towards Russia as it was pre-2014? Or do you believe he's in for a more expanded conflict where today it is Ukraine, tomorrow it could be some other part of what was the erstwhile Soviet Union?
You know, I'm not a mind reader. I cannot tell you what is in Mr. Putin's mind. But what the Russians have always signaled consistently is their hard security interest. They have not signaled their interest in a wider conflagration and some of these grander ideas that have been mentioned. But, you know, in the middle of a war, you must remember that rhetoric is also political. There's also the element of drama in what is being said. Much of the rhetoric will be maximalist. So I'm not sure that this is the right time to judge exactly where. We will know as we see this progress by the nature of what Russia does, what other countries do. Other countries, most of them have used very strong words, but they have all made it absolutely clear that they are not planning on sending troops into Ukraine. So far, that's what we have heard. Now, let's see where this goes. As I said, it's still early days. We can't say how far this will unfold. You know, the trouble with wars is that they're relatively easy to start, but they're very hard to control and even harder to end. And we've seen this over and over again. So I'm therefore very nervous making predictions.
How do you see, Mr. Menon, the response of the West, particularly the United States, which has imposed what it calls unprecedented sanctions against Russia? Do you really see this as effective? Do you believe that it will stop Russia from pursuing what you're describing as its national interests?
You know, I think the threat of sanctions, of extreme sanctions, of very strong sanctions, was made before the Russian military actions. Clearly, they didn't stop them. I am not sure whether announcing the fact that Russia was about to invade, whether that helped or didn't help. It could have worked either way. It could have helped to deter, but it obviously didn't. But on the other hand, it also raised the stakes. It's also meant that if Russia did not invade after the West at the highest levels had said they're about to invade, that they would appear chicken, that they had backed off in the face of Western threats of sanctions. So in a sense, did those threats make it inevitable? Or could they have deterred what happened? Today, with hindsight, you can say they didn't deter. And you can question the wisdom of that approach. But where it will end, we don't know.
But is there a sense that the world is unable to restrain what some would, the likes of Putin, the nationalist autocrats of our time, the muscular nationalist autocrats? The world at the moment, and the US in particular, which was once seen as this sort of global cop, super cop, is unable to create a situation where they can act as an effect, where there is any effective deterrence. Do you believe that is a concern, not just now in Ukraine, but it could happen in other parts of the world, that there is no global policeman left anymore?
I think that's a development that happened some time ago. I mean, it's not a recent development that suddenly explains what has happened in Ukraine now. The fact that after the global financial crisis in 2008, all the powers were reduced, and that there has actually been an absence of an order of the so-called liberal international order, rule-based order. It has not been functioning. And we saw what happened it didn't even respond to the pandemic, to the COVID pandemic. So we are a world adrift. When you say leaders who are nationalist and authoritarian, you could be talking about any one of many leaders around the world. This is not a unique phenomenon unique to Russia. So, I'm not sure that these lines of analysis actually lead anywhere very productive. For every example, you can find a counterexample in the last 15, 20 years, the moment you broaden the lens. And these are being used as part of propaganda, as part of controlling the narrative and shaping it.
You mentioned, of course, that wars are easy to start, very difficult to end, and one doesn't know how they will end. What is the best case scenario that you see, Mr. Menon, and what's the worst case scenario that you fear?
I'm no military expert, and I'm not going to go there. I don't want to start speculating on things that I really don't know.
But what I mean is, what would be, to your mind, the best way to resolve the conflict? You said peace, diplomacy. The Russians don't seem keen to back out of Ukraine at the moment until they perhaps, as I said, have a regime which is seen as pro-Russia. Given that, how do you see this ending? Do you see this ending through diplomacy? Do you believe that the Russians at all are interested at the moment in diplomacy?
I don't know. I can't speak for the Russians, but for me, the best outcome would be a neutral, non-aligned Ukraine, free of foreign presence, which is no threat to anybody, and therefore leading to a larger European security order, which assures mutual security to the powers concerned, Russia, Germany, all the East European states, all of them together. And they have to build this new order based on current realities of power, economic power, military power primarily, but they need to work on the basis of what they have today, which is very different from any of the earlier orders and the times before. So that would be, from my point of view, the best outcome if it were arrived at peacefully through negotiation.
My final question, in a way, and I want to return to India. There are those who say India is today caught between the devil and the deep sea. The fact is, India is close to all the major players, in a way, in this conflict. Russia, the US, EU, Ukraine. India has an inventory of over 60% of arms of Russian origin. On the other hand, the US is our biggest trade partner. Investments in India, one of the largest. Is that how you see it, that we are caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, or would that be an exaggeration?
I think that's an exaggeration. I think we're in the fortunate position of having good relations with all those involved. And frankly, as I said, while we might not be in a position to determine outcomes on the ground in Ukraine, I think we are in a position to argue the case of reason and good sense to all of them. And that's exactly what we are doing.
Just in conclusion, while we look, as you said, on India, the conflict reflecting, as some say, the reality of this new world order, a more multipolar world order. Do you believe that it sort of suggests the limits of NATO, limits of that post-World War order, and that is reflected here? How, in a way, do you give us once again, in conclusion, the big picture as you see it, Mr. Menon? As I said at the very outset, limited war or possibly a war that exposes the cleavages of this so-called new world multipolar order?
Well, firstly, I don't think this is a multipolar world. This is a confused world. It might be multipolar in economic terms. There are several major economies driving the world economy. But in military terms, there is still there's only one superpower who can project power across the globe, the US. The US has made it clear that she doesn't want to be militarily involved in Ukraine directly. She will not send troops and so on. But there is a flattening of the balance of power, of military power. And political power, as you see, is completely confused all around the world. So today we are in a much more uncertain, much more anarchic situation than we have been used to for many years. And therefore, you will see many more of these sorts of conflicts. There are many more flashpoints. All the hotspots are alive. We see it in Asia, whether it's from the East China Sea, South China Sea, Taiwan, and so on. You see it in Europe, you see it elsewhere. Because we are a world adrift. We are not a multipolar world. We're not a bipolar world. We are a world adrift between orders. Until we find a new order and we work one out for ourselves, I'm afraid you are going to see much more instability, much more conflict. Violence has gone up.
Well, you've said India has to sort of just wait and watch, in a way, what's happening. But there will be those who will say the Western backlash on Russia may not be easy for India to deal with, because when it comes to the impact of the sanctions, possibly on New Delhi's military purchases with Moscow, oil prices shooting up. In that sense, this conflict will presumably affect India in some way or the other, or do you believe that that is not something you're worried about?
There's no question it will affect us, but please don't underestimate India. We have handled much harder situations in the past. I mean, we've stayed non-aligned in much more difficult situations when our means were much more limited, when we were much weaker, and we still did. And it served India's interests well. And this is why I come back to it. Do whatever we need to serve India's interests. And I think that's where I don't see any advantage in picking one side or another, or in blaming or judging, because ultimately what we want is a reasonable outcome. And that I've described to you.
Okay. Mr. Shivshankar Menon, for giving us a sense of what you think this war in Ukraine means for the world and indeed for India. Appreciate your joining us and giving us your perspective. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you, Rajdeep. Thank you very much.